I'm going to start by showing you 3 images drawn from Google Earth. And I think for most of us who live in the developing world or who have traveled to the developing world or worked there, this type of landscape is a very familiar one. We see here the bottom half of the slide, the peopled landscape, the inhabited landscape, and the top half, the protected area. We don't need to draw a line on that image to show us the boundary of the protected area. There it is, starkly etched. Peopled landscape, protected area. This is from Karnataka State, Bandipur National Park. But it could be almost anywhere in the developing world. But here's one much closer to home. In fact, it's home to one of my co-panelists. This is the north of the Kruger National Park. On the right, the gray area is the protected, the park. On the left, the inhabited landscape. And here's a final one. The dark shaded area in the bottom half of the slide is a forest, one of the last remnants, the last refuges for the giant or the large sifakas and lemurs in Madagascar. That's Andasibe-Mantadia National Park. We can, in fact, see the encroachment, the deforestation. Again, peopled landscape. And now, in this environment, in the environment I'm talking about, many of our parks face a crisis of legitimacy. In these areas, parks and the businesses they sustain are enclaves, often, in landscapes that are scarred by losses, historic losses, dispossessions, colonial dispossessions, more recent removals. One of my co-panelists was removed as a small boy from an area that became the north of the Kruger National Park, right? But also current conflicts, the ongoing conflicts between wildlife and humans. There's a very good example of it. And then landscapes that are often shaped by poverty, by underdevelopment, right? By lack of employment, by a lack of skills. This quote is taken from the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, one of South Africa's World Heritage sites on our eastern seaboard. But it could come from the management plan, I think, of just about any protected area in the developing world. In these contexts, the need to ensure that tangible benefits flow from the protected area to local communities is not only an economic, but also a conservation imperative, right? That is the only way in which we will overcome this crisis of legitimacy. Now, what is the mechanism? Perhaps calling it the mechanism is overstating it. Perhaps we should say a mechanism, and I'll end this presentation with some modesty. But right now, I want to say that integrating parks and local concessions by using parks and local economies by using tourism concessions can help to address that crisis of legitimacy. It can help to compensate for losses. It can alleviate poverty. It can develop skills. It can diversify livelihoods. And very importantly, it can give voice to those people who were disempowered in the past, who suffered the losses in many areas of colonialism. Now, what are the elements of concessioning, of a good developmental concessioning process? Now, we've got very little time, and I'll skim over this. It links to a lot of what Andy discussed earlier. But first of all, and I think most importantly, we need a commitment to increased local returns that has to lie at the heart of our concessioning system. So this commitment has to permeate the entire concession life cycle. You can see there, from conception through planning, through procurement, into the management phase. This must be a priority that is embedded at the heart of the concessioning system. That means that at the award stage, our concession prospectuses, our requests for proposals, must contain specific requirements. We advocate an approach where we require of our bidders, of our applicants, to make specific commitments, and these are really the elements of those commitments that we want to look at. Increased local employment. We can expect shared ownership. There's a huge amount of very rich experimentation that has happened, and some of my co-panelists will speak about that. Equity partnerships, joint venture partnerships, rentals for the use of local resources, ownership partners. Then the procurement of goods and services in the local economy. And then finally, that last element, and where a company, a corporation, a business is investing socially, make sure that that investment is in the local economy. If you're going to build a school or a clinic, do it locally. That's a contribution. Those commitments have to be heavily weighted in the mix of criteria we use to evaluate concessions, right? And there are trade-offs involved here. Let's be clear. You know, when we are balancing the financial return, the concession fee, with the technical expertise or the experience of the operator, we have to, in that balance, place heavy weight on the commitment to build local economic returns. And then once that award has been made, once that concession has been awarded, those commitments have to be incorporated into the concession contract. That is the instrument, the legal instrument we have to ensure that we translate, we entrench those commitments. Then, of course, we have to go into the management phase and monitor and enforce in the spirit of partnership, as Andy mentioned, but we have to monitor and enforce those commitments over the entire contract period. Now, I'm going to end with a few lessons. There's so much here, but I want to start by saying that, you know, I think the 20 years I've spent in this field, since I first met Massyn, he reminded me 2 weekends ago we were sitting, and he said to me, we met 20 years ago, and we had big dreams 20 years ago. Well, I think our practice over the last 20 years, and what we've learned from others, is that concessions can be powerful drivers of development. They can have a development impact. But I also think we have to be modest in the claims we make. They are certainly not a cure-all for economic underdevelopment in the rural areas of the developing world. They are not a panacea. So in conclusion, let me make a few points. Concessions for development require, and this is really a few points from a much larger checklist. First is, and Andy's mentioned it, this is even perhaps more critical in the developing world, we need functioning institutions. We need institutions with the capacity and the integrity to implement the concession systems. We often, and this is not only the protected area agency, but the whole governmental framework, the legal regulatory framework within which we work. Building development through concessions is not a short-term intervention, despite the short horizons of many donor programs. And then I want to, as one of my last points, emphasize perhaps one of the most important elements, and that is that we need to ensure the business viability, the profitability of the concessions in our protected areas. Commitment to local benefit, to building local economies, often comes at a cost. And that cost requires a trade-off. Often we have to reduce the concession fees, look for other subsidies. But importantly, we have to keep in mind that we cannot kill the golden goose. And then finally, I'm going to skip over the balancing of local and regional because I've just seen the cutoff mark. I want to stress that we are trying to build resilient local economies. Tourism concessions are only one element in a diversified strategy. We have to guard against over-reliance on tourism. It's one element, an important element, but it has to be integrated into a broader developmental strategy.